In 1945, Germany was collapsing, its air force was losing control of the skies, and most late-war fighter projects were being designed under pressure that left little room for real long-term planning. Many were emergency solutions built to answer Allied bombing and the growing weakness of German air defences. Some were rushed, some were impractical, and many were already too late before they left the drawing board. But the TAR-183 stood out immediately because it did not look like a stopgap design. Its shape was sharper, cleaner, and more modern than most wartime fighters around it. The swept wings, compact fuselage, and high-mounted tail gave it a silhouette that looked closer to the next generation of jet combat than to the final months of World War II. Behind that design was Hans Multhopp, an engineer whose work on high-speed aerodynamics made him one of the most important late-war figures in German aircraft development. What made Multhopp important was not simply that he worked on another advanced fighter proposal. The TR-183 represented a clear break from the logic that had shaped most earlier combat aircraft. By 1945, engineers were learning that jet propulsion alone would not guarantee better performance. Speed was increasing, and with it came new aerodynamic problems that older fighter layouts were not built to handle well. Wing shape was becoming a central issue. The TR-183 reflected that shift directly. Its swept wings were not there to make the aircraft look futuristic. They were there because aircraft approaching higher speeds began to suffer more serious drag and control problems than conventional wartime fighters had faced. Multhopp understood that a future jet fighter could not simply be an older design with a new engine. It needed a different aerodynamic foundation. That is why the TA-183 matters, even though it never entered combat. It was designed around the idea that the next generation of fighters would need to operate in a speed range where traditional assumptions were starting to fail. At higher speeds, airflow changed, control became more difficult, and layouts that worked well for earlier aircraft began to show their limits. Multhopp's response was to push toward a cleaner, more compact fighter built around swept wings, and a shape intended for a new kind of air combat. The TA-183 was still a late war project, but its priorities were different from many of the desperate designs surrounding it. It was not only trying to survive the present crisis, it was trying to solve the problems of the near future before the war even ended. That is what makes Hans Multhopp such a strong subject in World War II aviation. He did not create a fighter that changed the battlefield directly, and the TAR-183 never had the chance to prove itself in service. But that does not make it unimportant. In some ways, it makes it more revealing. The TAR-183 shows what some German engineers had already realized by the end of the war. The next major leap in fighter design would not come from more power alone. It would come from changing the wing itself. The real question is not whether the TAR-183 could have changed the war if it had flown in time. The real question is why Hans Multhopp's wing ideas looked so advanced that they continued to matter even after the war that produced them was already over. What made the TAR-183 so important was not that it was simply another late-war jet proposal. Its real significance was the way Hans Multhopp treated the wing as the key to the entire aircraft. By 1945, engineers were learning a hard lesson. Once speed increased into the upper limits of wartime aviation, older wing logic started to fail. Aircraft built around straight wings and familiar proportions could still fly fast, but they began to encounter more drag, more control problems, and more instability as they pushed toward the edge of the jet age. Multhopp understood that if future fighters were going to move faster and remain effective, the wing itself had to change. That is why the TA-183's swept wings mattered so much. They were not a stylistic choice. They were a direct response to the aerodynamic penalties that appeared as aircraft approached higher speed flight. The advantage of a swept wing was simple in theory but difficult in practice. By angling the wing backward, engineers could reduce some of the airflow problems that became more serious as speed increased. In practical terms, that meant the aircraft could handle higher speed flight more efficiently than a comparable straight-wing design. That did not solve every problem, but it brought valuable margin in a speed range where every aerodynamic penalty mattered more. Multhopp built the TA-183 around that idea from the start. The swept wings worked together with a compact fuselage, a clean intake arrangement, and a layout that looked more like a true next-generation jet fighter than a transitional wartime machine. This is what made the aircraft so important on paper. It was not just fast-looking, it was designed around a more modern understanding of what high-speed combat would demand. That is also why the TA-183 deserves attention, even though it never flew in combat. Most famous World War II aircraft earned their reputation through service records, production totals, or battlefield performance. The T-183 belongs to a different category. It matters because it captured a design direction at exactly the moment military aviation was changing. Multhopp was working on a fighter that recognized a coming reality. The next generation of combat aircraft would need wings shaped for speed first, not simply for the habits of earlier dogfighting. The TR-183's overall form reflected that shift. It was compact, aggressive, and built around the idea that the future fighter would have to manage airflow differently from the machines that dominated most of the war. In that sense, the aircraft was less a final German wartime fighter and more an early blueprint for the logic of post-war jet combat. That is what makes Multhopp's engineering so compelling. He was not simply chasing a faster aircraft, he was trying to solve the aerodynamic problem that speed itself was creating. And that is a very different kind of design challenge. The real question is not whether the TAR-183 looked advanced. It clearly did. The real question is whether Hans Multhopp had already identified the wing logic that would shape the next era of fighter design before the war that forced the idea into existence had even ended. Hans Multhopp did not get the chance to prove the TAR-183 in combat, and that is exactly why the aircraft remains so fascinating. It was never tested under the pressure of real missions, never measured against Allied fighters in the air, and never given the opportunity to show whether its design could deliver on the promise visible in its shape. That leaves historians with an unavoidable limitation. We can study the concept, the aerodynamics, and the timing, but we cannot claim the TAR-183 was a proven wartime weapon. What we can say is that it represented one of the clearest signs that some late war engineers already understood where fighter design was heading. The aircraft did not matter because it fought. It mattered because it revealed what high-speed combat was beginning to demand. The most important part of Multhopp's legacy is not the TAR-183 alone. It is the fact that the aircraft reflected a broader shift in aviation thinking at the end of the war. For years, fighter development had been shaped by the needs of piston engine combat, climb rate, turn performance, manageable drag, and structural strength within familiar aerodynamic limits. But as speeds increased, especially with the arrival of jets, those older assumptions began to lose value. Engineers could no longer depend on more power alone. They had to deal with new airflow behaviour, new control challenges, and new penalties that became much more serious as aircraft pushed toward the transonic range. Multhopp's work on the TA-183 showed that he understood this change clearly. He was not just proposing another jet fighter, he was designing around the aerodynamic reality that future fighters would need a different wing logic than the aircraft that had defined most of World War II. That is why the TA-183 became more important after the war than during it. It stood at the point where wartime urgency met the first real shape of post-war fighter design. Even without entering service, it became part of a larger conversation about swept wings, compact jet layouts, and the direction of future high-speed aircraft. This is where Multhopp becomes especially relevant to aviation history. He represents the engineer who worked at the edge of a transition rather than inside a stable design era. The TAR-183 was not a battlefield success, but it was a clear indicator of where military aviation was moving. In that sense, Multhopp's contribution belongs less to the final chapter of World War II than to the opening chapter of the jet age. That is what makes Hans Multhopp such a strong figure for this story. He did not build the aircraft that won the war, and he did not produce a fighter that changed combat through mass deployment. What he did was more subtle and, in some ways, more important for long-term aviation history. He helped define the aerodynamic direction that later fighter design would follow. The TI-183 was never the weapon that saved a collapsing air force. It was something more revealing than that. Proof that the future of air combat was already being drawn before the war itself had finished. So the real question is this: was Hans Multhopp simply designing one more desperate late-war fighter? Or was he sketching the shape of the jet age before the battlefield was even ready for it,